James Livingston pulled his sleek, silent electric car into the private airport, the soft hum of the engine blending with the crisp morning air. The airport, though small, exuded exclusivity, reserved for those who had worked hard enough, fought long enough, to claim their place among the elite. James was one of them. He had earned this. His private jet stood proudly on the tarmac, its polished chrome reflecting the golden sunrise, a symbol of his empire, his hard-fought success. The bold, clean lines of his company's logo gleamed on. The fuselage, a testament to the aviation dynasty he had built with relentless determination. Today's trip was yet another step towards solidifying his dominance in the market, another milestone in a journey that had been anything but easy. As he stepped out of his car, his polished dress shoes clicked against the pavement. He adjusted. His tailored navy suit checked his watch, a functional yet elegant piece, a mark of his achievements, and exhaled. The ground crew nearby quieted. Conversations stalled. Eyes flicked in his direction. James knew that look. It was subtle but unmistakable. The hesitation, the double takes, the silent question lingering in their expressions. Does he belong here? He had seen it before. He had felt it before. It was the unspoken challenge that came with being a black man in spaces where few expected him to be. He nodded politely at the crew as he made his way toward his jet, but their responses were stiff, guarded. Their unease clung to the air, thick and suffocating. He pushed forward, his mind shifting to the high-stakes meeting ahead. His company was on the verge of breaking into new international markets, a move that could redefine the future of his business. He should have been focused on that, but the tension in the air kept tugging at his attention. Then it happened. Stocky ground crew member stepped forward, hesitant but firm. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone laced with something James couldn't quite place. "Are you the pilot for this aircraft?" James raised an eyebrow. "Here we go." "Yes," he replied smoothly, keeping his voice calm and measured. "I'm the owner and the pilot." A flicker of disbelief crossed the man's face before he quickly masked it. "I see. Well, we just need to double-check some things before you take off. Standard procedure." James knew better. This wasn't standard. He had been through this process countless times before, and the scrutiny he was facing now was far from routine. But he also knew there was no point in arguing. Yet. He handed over his pilot's license and necessary documentation, watching as the man took them, scanning the papers with unnecessary intensity before heading toward the control tower. His gut twisted. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, something uglier. Then his phone buzzed. A meeting reminder. He dismissed it. Right now, the more pressing matter was the growing whispers among the ground crew, the furtive glances, the weight of their skepticism pressing down on him like an invisible force. But James had spent a lifetime pushing through doubt, proving people wrong. He wouldn't let it shake him now. He turned back to his jet, continuing his pre-flight checks, running his hands along the wings, the tires, the engine. But then, movement in the distance. 2 airport security officers, standing rigid at the edge of the runway. Watching him, James exhaled sharply. Not again. Then, as if the universe had decided to put his patience to the ultimate test, the flashing lights of a police car sliced through the morning haze. Red and blue beams bounced off the tarmac, off the polished surface of his jet, off his skin. James closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. He had a bad feeling about this. He unbuckled his seatbelt, inhaled deeply, and climbed out of the cockpit. As his polished shoes met the ground, he braced himself for what was coming next. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands resting a little too close to their holsters. "Sir, step away from the aircraft," one of them barked, his voice sharp with suspicion. He was stocky, with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses that reflected the bright morning sky and the gleaming jet behind James. James raised his hand slightly, a gesture of calm control. "Good morning, officers. I'm James Livingston, the owner and pilot of this aircraft. Is there a problem?" "Problem?" The officer squinted, ignoring the polite introduction. "We got a call about some suspicious activity." His tone made it clear who the suspicious one was. "I need to see some ID." Keeping his expression even, James reached into his tailored jacket and handed over his wallet. Pilot's license, certifications, plane registration, all of it. The second officer, younger and cocky, snatched the papers like he'd already made up his mind. "This your plane?" the first officer asked, disbelief dripping from every word. "Yes, I've owned it for 3 years. My company operates several aircraft just like this one." The younger officer sneered. "Must be nice," he muttered. Not even hiding his skepticism. James bit his tongue, swallowing the anger rising inside. He knew this game. Assumptions, accusations, all before the facts had a chance to breathe. The officers exchanged a glance, and the older one gave a small, knowing nod. They weren't buying it. "Look," the older officer said, his voice tightening, into something more threatening. "We need to verify these documents. There's been a lot of fraud lately. Can't take any chances." James exhaled slowly. "I understand," he said, keeping his voice even. But everything inside him screamed that this was no routine check. "Step away from the aircraft while we sort this out." James stepped back, his jaw clenched tight. The younger officer flipped through the documents with a smirk, like it was already a foregone conclusion that James didn't belong here. A small crowd of airport staff had gathered at the edge of the runway, whispering and pointing. No one spoke up to defend him. No one bothered to clarify that James was exactly who he said he was. "Where you headed, Mr. Livingston?" the younger officer asked, suspicion dripping from every syllable. "New York. Business meeting." James kept his voice measured. The older officer nodded, filing the answer away like evidence. "Why not hire a pilot?" James offered a tight smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Because I am the pilot." Another glance passed between the officers, this one soaked in disbelief. The younger officer snorted. "Let me get this straight. You're the owner and the pilot? You just show up by yourself? No crew? No assistant?" "That's correct," James said. "It's not my first flight." The silence that followed stretched thick and heavy. Finally, the older officer lifted his radio. "Control, we need a full ID check and verification on a private aircraft. Stand by." His eyes never left James. James felt the knot in his stomach tighten. A full ID check wasn't routine. This was the start of something deeper, something meant to delay, humiliate, or worse. "You're not going anywhere until we confirm everything," the younger officer added, his smile practically begging for a reaction. James opened his mouth, then closed it again. Fighting would only fuel the fire. He folded his arms and stood silently. "Mind if we take a look inside the plane?" the older officer asked, trying to sound casual. "Actually, yes, I do mind." James's voice was firm. "This is private property, and unless you have a warrant, I'd prefer you didn't search it." The officer's jaw tightened. "If you've got nothing to hide, what's the problem?" James met his stare head-on. "The problem is that I've shown you every document you asked for. I've followed every rule. If you still don't believe me, that's your bias, not my problem." The older officer stepped back, smirking like James had just made things more interesting. "Fine. Don't leave town. We'll be back." James gave a curt nod, rage simmering just beneath the surface. As the officers returned to their patrol cars, James caught the sneer from the younger one, a sneer James knew too well. He took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. There, James stood, polished shoes on sun-warmed tarmac, the flashing red, and blue lights reflecting off the chrome of his jet. This wasn't new, but it didn't hurt any less. He could feel the weight of 100 judgments hanging in the air, from the officers, the airport staff, even the passers-by who didn't know him, but already assumed the worst. He dialed a familiar number. "James? What's going on?" Rebecca Sterling's voice came sharp and ready. "I'm at the airport. Cops are here. They're holding me up, questioning if I even own my own plane, even though I gave them every document under the sun." There was a pause, and James could almost hear Rebecca's teeth grinding. "Did they search the plane?" "No. I told them they needed a warrant." "Good." Her voice was a blade now. "I'm on my way. Don't say anything else until I get there." "Thanks, Rebecca. Hang tight, and whatever you do, don't let them get under your skin." The call ended, and James slid the phone back into his pocket. But his pulse still pounded in his ears. Across the tarmac, the officers were talking to someone new, a man with silver hair and a stern expression, a higher up. The conversation was heated, all hand gestures and head shakes. It didn't look good. Then the younger officer broke away and strode back toward James, the smirk plastered on his face like a badge of honor. "Mr. Livingston," he said, voice oozing false politeness, "we're gonna need you to step away from the aircraft completely. You're not allowed near it until our investigation is over." James stood tall, his frustration boiling just below the surface, but his voice stayed calm. "This is my plane, my property, and I've done nothing wrong." The officer's smile widened. "We'll see about that." James narrowed his eyes. "And how long is this going to take? I have a business meeting I can't afford to miss." The officer gave a lazy shrug, not bothering to hide his indifference. "As long as it takes. We have to make sure this plane isn't stolen." James clenched his jaw, swallowing the sharp reply rising in his throat. "I've provided everything you asked for. My pilot's license, registration, every piece of documentation. It's all in order." The officer crossed his arms, the smirk still plastered across his face. "We've seen forged paperwork before. Especially with expensive toys like this one. Can't be too careful, right?" The words hit like a slap. After everything James had built, every hurdle cleared, every win earned, he was still here, back at square one, treated like some thief trying to pull off a con. It was infuriating. "I understand you have a job to do," James said, his voice strained but controlled, "but this is harassment." The officer's smirk widened into a full grin. "Harassment? Nah, just doing our due diligence. You wouldn't want us letting someone steal a plane right off your hands, would you?" James forced himself to stay silent. He knew exactly what this was, a setup, bait dangling on a hook, waiting for him to snap. One wrong word, one flash of anger, and they'd have exactly what they wanted. Before James could respond, a group of airport security staff appeared, drawn to the commotion like moths to a flame. Their leader, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy uniform with the airport's insignia stitched on his chest, stepped forward. "What's the situation here?" the man asked, his politeness paper-thin, the suspicion in his eyes already fixed on James. The younger officer answered first. "We got a call about suspicious activity. This gentleman says he owns the plane. We're just verifying that." The security official nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving James. Doubt flickered across his face, settling in like it belonged there. "It's just unusual," the man added. "Someone flying their own jet without a crew. You can understand why that raises questions, Mr. Livingston." James took a slow breath, fighting to keep his composure. "It's not unusual at all, for a licensed pilot who happens to own the aircraft." The official's mouth tightened, unconvinced. "Be that as it may, I think it's best you cooperate fully until this is resolved." There it was. The room was already tilted against him, and they were leaning into it hard. The officers and the airport staff had formed an unspoken alliance, a shared assumption that James didn't belong. The older officer stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt near his holster. His stance radiated quiet threat. "We can make this easy, or we can make it hard," he said, his voice low. "Step away from the aircraft. Otherwise, we'll have to arrest you for obstruction." James felt his pulse spike, heat flooding his face. Arrested for standing near his own plane. The absurdity of it was staggering. But this wasn't about facts. It was about power, and right now they had it all. He raised his hands slightly, the universal signal of surrender. "I'm stepping back," he said evenly. "But let's be clear. I'm complying under protest. This is my property, and I've done nothing wrong." The officer gave a slight, dismissive nod. Just another box checked. Another move in the game. James stepped away, heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel every eye on him. The officers, the airport staff, even the distant passengers craning their necks to get a look at the scene. Despite owning the aircraft, despite every document proving his rights, he stood there stripped of authority, reduced to a spectacle. The younger officer strolled up, smirking. "Turn around," he ordered. "We need to search you." James's brow furrowed. "Search me? For what?" "Standard procedure." The officer's grin was pure mockery. "Unless you've got something to hide." James gritted his teeth, but turned slowly, hands at his sides. The officer's hands moved with unnecessary force, patting him down like he was a drug mule at the border, deliberately invasive, another invitation to lose his temper. When they found nothing, the officer stepped back, disappointment flickering across his face. "Huh," he muttered. "Clean." James turned, locking eyes with him. "I told you," he said, voice low and calm. "I have nothing to hide." The officer shrugged, but there was tension in his shoulders now, the first sign that the situation wasn't unfolding exactly the way they wanted. "Doesn't mean you're free to go," the older officer cut in. "We're still waiting on verification." James stared at the ground, fists curling and uncurling at his sides. It was all so familiar, this endless cycle where proof was never enough, where every success could be questioned away the moment the right people decided to see him as a threat, instead of a man. He glanced at his phone, checking the time. Every minute wasted here nudged him closer to missing the meeting, one that could secure a deal his company had worked months to land. Frustration coiled tighter in his chest. Not fear, exhaustion, bone-deep exhaustion from fighting the same fight over and over. He pulled out his phone and dialed Rebecca Sterling. "James," she answered immediately, her voice sharp, already knowing. Something was wrong. "I'm 5 minutes out. What's happening?" "They're still holding me," he said, voice low. "They searched me. They're calling him back up, and they're talking about detaining me until they verify everything." Rebecca's sharp inhale crackled through the line, followed by a curse, a rare crack in her usual composure. "This is unacceptable. Don't say another word to them. I'll handle it the second I get there." Her fury was reassuring, but James knew reality wouldn't bend just because his lawyer was fierce. "They're already talking about obstruction. Charges," he added quietly. Rebecca's silence lasted half a heartbeat before she said, "They're pushing. Don't give them anything. Just stand still. I'm almost there." James ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket just as the older officer approached again. This time there was no pretense of civility left in his stance. Just that same smug certainty, the kind that said, "No matter what you do, we've already decided who you are." "Mr. Livingston," the officer began, his voice straining to sound polite, "we're still waiting to verify your documents. In the meantime, you need to remain right here. If you attempt to leave, we'll have no choice but to detain you." James gave a slow, measured nod, his expression unreadable. "Understood," he replied evenly, "but my attorney will be here shortly. I trust that won't be an issue." The officer's smug expression faltered just for a second, but James caught it. Then the smirk returned, though it didn't have the same weight behind it. "Of course," the officer said, though his confidence had taken a noticeable hit. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. James stood with his hands tucked into his pockets, his stance calm, but his mind working at a furious pace. Every possible scenario played out in his head. Best case, worst case, and everything in between. The officers loitered nearby, whispering to each other in low tones, shooting occasional glances in his direction. James could sense their frustration. They wanted him to crack, to lash out, to give them a reason to escalate. But he wouldn't. He knew this game too well. From the corner of his eye, James saw the airport employees still clustered near the terminal, gossiping amongst themselves. Their hushed murmurs were little more than background noise now, insignificant compared to the storm brewing right in front of him. The low growl of an approaching engine shattered the tense silence. James turned to see Rebecca's black sedan, pulling up at the edge of the tarmac, her arrival a welcome relief. She stepped out with purpose, heels clicking against the pavement like gunshots. In her sharp-cut suit with her leather briefcase in hand, she radiated control. Where the officers had tried to drown James in chaos, Rebecca brought clarity and fire. She didn't wait for introductions. "Who's in charge here?" she demanded, her voice slicing clean through the air. The older officer stepped forward, unimpressed by the theatrics. "I am," he said gruffly. "And you are?" "Rebecca Sterling," she replied crisply, flicking her credentials into view. "Legal counsel for Mr. Livingstone. Now, someone is going to explain to me why my client is being unlawfully detained." The officer hesitated, just long enough for Rebecca to pounce. "We're conducting an investigation," he said, trying to recover. "Mr. Livingstone's ownership is under review." Rebecca's eyes sharpened. "Under review by whom?" "He's provided every document you requested, documents that are legally binding and verifiable." "You have no grounds to hold him," the younger officer stepped in, emboldened by his partner's presence. "We're just being cautious," he said, with a grin that James recognized all too well. "Can't be too careful with high-end property like this." Rebecca's gaze landed on him, cold enough to cut glass. "What I know," she said slowly, "is that you're walking a very fine line toward unlawful detention. Mr. Livingstone has done nothing wrong, and every unnecessary minute you hold him here exposes you and your department to significant legal liability." "Then you'd better pray your protocol covers unlawful detainment," Rebecca shot back, "because that's exactly what this is. Release him now, or I'll have a judge on the phone before you can blink." For a moment no one spoke. The officers exchanged looks, caught between their pride and the sinking realization that Rebecca was not bluffing. The silence stretched until finally the older officer gave a stiff, reluctant nod. "Fine," he muttered. "He's free to go, but we'll be keeping an eye on this situation." Rebecca offered a thin, humorless smile. "By all means," she said smoothly, "and we'll be keeping an eye on you." She turned to James, her expression softening just slightly. "Let's go," she said quietly. James gave a small nod, grateful and still seething beneath the surface. As they walked back toward his jet, James cast one last glance at the officers, who stood huddled together like boys caught vandalizing a storefront. The gathered airport staff had already dispersed, sensing the show was over. But James knew better. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He fully intended to make sure these officers faced consequences. He climbed into the cockpit, settling into his seat with a slow, steady breath. Rebecca stood at the foot of the stairs, offering a reassuring nod. "I'll start making calls," she said. "This won't happen again." James forced a smile. "Thank you, Rebecca." She squeezed his shoulder briefly. "Take care of yourself, and don't let them win." James nodded, sealing the cockpit door behind him. The engine hummed to life beneath his hands, but the tension in his chest hadn't fully loosened. Even with Rebecca in his corner, the sting of it all lingered. not just the insult to his reputation, but the sheer exhaustion of fighting the same battles over and over. Just as he powered up the systems, his phone buzzed. A message from his business partner, Evan Richards, glowed on the screen. "On our way. Hang tight." James exhaled. Of all mornings for everything to go to hell, it had to be this one, when his future, his company's future, was hanging by a thread. The merger with Evan's firm wasn't just important, it was the cornerstone of everything they had been building. And now, thanks to this circus, they were dangerously close to losing it all. A knock at the cockpit door jolted him from his thoughts. He turned to see Rebecca again, her expression unreadable. "We're not done," she said, voice firm. "Your partners just arrived. I asked them to join us." James opened the door fully, stepping onto the tarmac, just as Evan Richards and Sarah Mitchell approached. Both were impeccably dressed, but their expressions were a mix of concern and thinly veiled impatience. Behind them, an airport official scurried nervously to keep up, face flushed. James tried to smile, though frustration still simmered beneath his skin. "Evan, Sarah, I'm sorry about all this," he said, gesturing toward the lingering patrol cars. "It's been a morning." Evan, tall and broad-shouldered, gripped James's hand in a firm handshake. His face was tight with anger and concern. "Ordeal is putting it lightly," he said, voice low but sharp. "We came the second we heard. What the hell happened here?" Before James could answer, Sarah cut in, her sharp gaze flicking toward the officers, still watching from a distance. "This is outrageous," she said. "We've been business partners for years, and they're treating you like a damn criminal. What's the situation?" Rebecca stepped forward, her polished professionalism unshaken despite the chaos. "We've made progress," she said, her voice clipped and clear. "The officers have been forced to back down. James is free to leave. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. I'm advising we file a formal complaint immediately. This was racial profiling, plain and simple, and unlawful detention on top of it." Evan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto the officers. "Good," he said. "They need to be held accountable. This wasn't just unprofessional. It was disgraceful." Sarah nodded sharply. "Our PR team's already on standby. Like it or not, this story's going to blow up, and we need to be ready." James appreciated their fire, but his mind was already working 2 steps ahead. The merger, the deal that could change everything, still hung in the balance. Public battles made headlines, and headlines could kill deals. "We'll handle it," James said, his tone calm but steely. "But right now, business comes first." Rebecca gave a tight nod. "Understood. I'll cover the legal end. We'll control the narrative until the timing's right." As they spoke, the airport official who had followed Evan and Sarah finally stepped forward. His face was flushed, his nerves barely concealed. "Mr. Livingstone," he stammered. "On behalf of the airport, I want to apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding." "Of course you do," Sarah cut in coldly. "But you should be asking yourselves how this even happened." The official stuttered, caught completely off guard. "It was just standard procedure. We needed to verify." "Verify what?" Evan's voice was sharp enough to cut steel. "That a black man can own a plane, that he can actually fly it. Don't insult our intelligence. This wasn't about security, this was prejudice." The official shrank under the heat of their combined fury. I assure you there was no ill intent. Security protocol can be imperfect. These things happen, right?" Rebecca's voice was razor-sharp. "Do you even realize how pathetic that sounds?" The man's face burned red, his composure cracking. "We'll review our procedures immediately. Please, accept our apologies." James's voice cut through the air like a knife, calm, clear, and utterly uncompromising. "We don't need apologies. We need change. This can't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." The official gave a frantic nod before practically fleeing the scene, leaving James and his team alone beside the jet. Across the tarmac, the officers still lingered by, their patrol cars Rattled, humiliated, and fully aware they'd lost this round, Evan turned to James, his voice softer now. "You handled that well," he said, "but you shouldn't have to." James exhaled, the weight of the morning pressing hard on his chest. "It's the reality I live with," he said quietly, "but it won't stop me. We've got work to do." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We're with you. Every step." James gave a grateful nod. "Let's close this deal. We've lost enough time." Rebecca was already on her phone, firing off instructions as she strode toward her car. "I'll make sure this doesn't disappear into some bureaucratic void," she called over her shoulder. "Focus on your meeting. I'll handle the rest." As the team boarded the jet, James settled into the pilot's seat, hands resting on the controls. The engines roared to life, the runway stretching out ahead of them. But even as they climbed into the sky, leaving the airport behind, James knew this wasn't over, not even close, because this fight, and the fight for dignity, for justice, for the right to exist without suspicion, didn't end at the edge of the tarmac. It followed him into the clouds. It followed him everywhere. James knew the battle was far from over. He appreciated his team's support. Their loyalty was undeniable, but this fight was bigger than any of them. "What about the airport?" he asked Rebecca, his voice low but steady. "What consequences are they actually facing?" Rebecca's expression darkened. "They're scrambling. They've issued a formal apology, but that's not enough. We're pushing for real changes. Mandatory anti-discrimination training, new protocols for handling private aircraft, public accountability, the works." James's jaw tightened. "Good, but I want those officers held accountable too. This wasn't a mistake, this was prejudice in action. They need to answer for it." Rebecca's voice sharpened. "They will. We're filing a civil rights lawsuit against both the police and the airport. This isn't about money. It's about making sure this never happens again." "Make it happen," James said simply. Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder, then turned back to her phone, already moving to make good on that promise. Evan and Sarah stayed close, a silent wall of support beside James, and then the story exploded. In the days that followed, news outlets ran the footage. Headlines screamed racial profiling, and social media lit up in fury. Voices from every corner of the country demanded answers. The police department issued a stiff, uncomfortable statement, admitting an internal investigation was underway. The airport followed suit, announcing mandatory diversity training and revised protocols. It was a step. But James knew steps weren't enough. The officers were placed on administrative leave, not fired, not charged, just benched. It wasn't justice, but it was a crack in the wall. And with Rebecca driving the legal machine forward, James knew that crack would only grow wider. Meanwhile, the merger, the deal James had worked years to secure, moved forward. Despite the chaos, despite the headlines, nothing could derail the future they were building. In fact, the ordeal had only hardened their resolve. A few days later, James was back in his office when Rebecca called. "We've made progress," she said. "The officers are facing disciplinary action. The airport agreed to every demand we made: systemic changes, accountability measures, and a public settlement." James exhaled, leaning back in his chair. But the fight wasn't just about winning a case. It was about sending a message to everyone who ever looked at a man like him and saw a threat instead of a success story. "Thank you," he said, quietly. "This is just the beginning," Rebecca replied. "We've taken the first step, but there's a long road ahead." After the call ended, James sat in silence, staring out the window. The skyline stretched before him, glittering, with possibility and with history. He thought back to the younger version of himself, the kid who was told, "You don't belong here," the man who had to prove over and over that he did. Now he wasn't just proving it, he was building something bigger. There was a knock, At the door, Evan and Sarah both looking energized and ready for the next chapter, all set for the final merger meeting. Evan asked. James glanced at the papers on his desk and smiled. It's all here. This deal will take us global. Sarah's eyes sparkled. You've come a long way, James. I can't wait to see where we are a year from now. James smiled. But his mind drifted again, back to the chaos at the airport, the media firestorm, the quiet moments after where he realized something profound. This fight wasn't just about him. It was about every person who ever got stopped, doubted, harassed and humiliated because of their skin color. He had the platform now. He had the resources, and it was time to use them. I've been thinking, James said, breaking the silence. This isn't just a business anymore. I want us to invest, not just in markets, but in people, in communities that get overlooked, in kids who've been told they can't. Evan leaned forward, intrigued. What are you thinking? A foundation, James said, one that focuses on education, mentorship, and legal defense for people targeted by discrimination. It's not just about fighting cases after they happen. It's about breaking the cycle. For a moment, the room was silent, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what James was proposing. Sarah's smile was soft, full of admiration. You're turning all of this into something that actually matters. That's incredible. I've been lucky, James said quietly. I had the resources to fight back. Most people don't. That's what we need to change. Evan grinned. Now that's a legacy. Sarah raised an eyebrow. So, what's the first step? James smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't just about hope, but about certainty. We build this foundation, we fund it ourselves, and we make sure no one ever faces what I faced alone. They didn't need to say anything else. Evan, Sarah, Rebecca, they were all in. This wasn't just a business anymore, it was a movement.